exhibit, The Lost Amazon, the photographic journey of the legendary botanist Richard Evans Schultes, is currently on the temporary exhibit hall right off the rotunda. So if you haven't been in there to see the exhibit firsthand, I suggest you take some time, maybe after the lecture or another visit to the museum, to go through the exhibit. If you've already seen it, then you're going to learn some more about what you saw already in the exhibit. As Debbie said, my name is John Kress. I'm a curator of botany and a research scientist in the Department of Botany here at the Smithsonian. Those of you that don't know that we do research at the Smithsonian, there are 7 scientific departments here in the Natural History Museum with about 75 PhD level scientists conducting research on a daily basis, describing the biodiversity and the cultures of the planet. That's what we do. I'm fortunate to be trained as a tropical botanist, and my job is to document tropical plants around the world. I'm fortunate that one of my professors, Richard Evans Schultes at Harvard, inspired me to do this, and it's a great pleasure to be able to host this exhibit about a professor that had a profound influence on my life, as I will talk to you about. This lecture will be about the exhibit, about Schultes, about the Amazon, and also kind of how we go about producing an exhibit like this. So I'll talk something about selecting the photos and putting it together and the support we needed to do that. This exhibit could not have been possible. Actually, the inspiration for the exhibit was this book with the same title, The Lost Amazon, that was written by Wade Davis, another student of Schultes, and Chris Murray, who's the director and founder of the Govinda Gallery in Georgetown. They discovered that Schultes had taken thousands of black and white photographs during his 12 years in the Amazon region of the country of Colombia. They decided these photographs were so startling and so engaging that it told a lot about Schultes and it was worth putting a book together. When I saw the book, I said it's also worth putting an exhibit together to bring this to a broader audience that visits the museum here. So the exhibit really began as an exhibit of the photographs that were first brought to life in this book. For those of you interested, the book is available in the bookshop here if after seeing the exhibit you want to learn more about Schultes. Now, let me say that Wade Davis, who wrote the book, The Lost Amazon, as well as another very intriguing book about Schultes' life as a botanist, as an ethnobotanist, who lives here in Washington as an explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society. I invited him to be a guest curator with me on the exhibit, along with Chris Murray, who, as I said earlier, is the director of the Govinda Gallery. Chris has a real eye for photography, and Wade knew the subject very well. So the three of us, working with the team in the exhibits department, including Sarah Gruesome, who's the writer, Mike Lawrence, who was the designer of the exhibit, which was an excellent design, and Carolyn Margolis, who was the project manager. This team put this exhibit together, and it took us about 3 years to do it, from the original concept that came about from the book, The Lost Amazon, to the time we opened just a few months ago. Now, as Debbie also mentioned, we cannot put on an exhibit in this museum without support, financial support and funding support, and I'm very pleased to say that a lot of that support came from the country of Colombia, first the Banco de la República, and as well as the Embassy of Colombia. And I'm very pleased that the Ambassador of Colombia is here with us this afternoon, who can correct anything I say wrong about the beautiful country of Colombia. But I won't say anything wrong, I guarantee that. Also, Conservation International, some of you may know, a very important conservation program here based in Washington, and our own Latino Initiatives Pool, which is an internal Smithsonian fund that supports programs in Latino studies and Latino acknowledgement. All right, now we can get to the actual exhibit. The Lost Amazon, the photographic journey of legendary botanist Richard Evans Schultes. Schultes died in 2001. He's no longer with us. He was probably one of the most outstanding, well-known plant explorers of the 20th century. It's very interesting that maybe the final, or the next installment of the Indiana Jones films recently opened in theaters. And in my mind, Schultes went way beyond what we think of in terms of Indiana Jones. Schultes was indeed somebody that went to the ends of the earth, looking for new plants, looking for new discoveries, looking for documentation of plants so we would know more about plant life in the tropics. This exhibit, although it talks about the photographic journey of the legendary botanist Richard Evans Schultes, it's not really about Schultes at all. It's about the Amazon. And it's about the Amazon from the period 1941 to 1952, when Schultes spent 12 years exploring the region of Colombia that drains into the Amazon basin. And it's about the changes he saw in the Amazon during those 12 years. And probably some of you will recognize the changes that occurred since that time as you look at these photographs. It's about the places that Schultes went. It's about the plants that he collected, and it's about the people that he engaged during that time in the Amazon basin. All of the photographs you see here were taken by Schultes. In fact, his camera, a small Rolleiflex 2x2 handheld camera, is in the exhibit, and you can see the actual camera that Schultes used to take these photographs. All of them are his photographs. So what you're seeing in the exhibit is really the Amazon through the eyes of one of the most important botanists of the 20th century. Now, Schultes was a botanist, and what we do as botanists, we collect plants to document plant diversity, whatever region we're working in, whether it's South America, the Amazon, whether it's Southeast Asia, where I work now, whether it's Africa, whether it's the Arctic. We're always collecting specimens to document how plants, or what plants were found in a particular place at a particular time. Schultes, during his career, collected over 25,000 specimens, many of which we have here in the U.S. National Herbarium, many of which are at Harvard University, where he was a professor. Now, when we talk about the Amazon, or when you think about the Amazon, you probably think about that giant river, the largest river in the world. That's not frozen? Not frozen. Okay, good. You think about that giant river that flows. Let's see, I kind of cut this off, but I wanted to show more of this region. Here is the northern part of South America, and the Amazon essentially starts in the Andes, which run up here. All these tributaries flow into the Amazon, which is right down here, the true Amazon River. And then that river flows slowly through mostly Brazilian, the country of Brazil, until it reaches the Atlantic coast over here near Belém. But that's not really just the Amazon along that river. The Amazon basin extends everywhere, from the Andes all the way down the spine of South America. Everything that flows out of the east side of the Andes really flows into the Amazon River. And Schultes spent most of his time in the country of Colombia, although the Amazon includes parts of Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. Most of the time he spent during those 12 years were in the departments that make up the Amazon basin of the country of Colombia. Here's Colombia here. The rest of the country is on this side, and these four departments are where Schultes spent most of his time, particularly the region of Baupés, Caquetá, Putumayo, and Amazonas. And there are a number of rivers, major rivers, that flowed into the Amazon. Schultes spent his time on the Rio Apapores, the Rio Sucumbios, the Rio Putumayo, a number of others that flow down here. Eventually, this is the only real little part of Colombia down near Leticia that touches on the true Amazon River. But all of this really is considered the Amazon basin. So when we talk about the lost Amazon, it's really this greater region, and it's not just floating down the main Amazon River that you think about. Also, because this river is coming down, or these waters are flowing down out of the Andes, it's not a slow, meandering little river at all. The Amazon, all of these rivers that I mentioned, the Apapores, the Caquetá, the Putumayo, the Sucumbios, all of them are, as they make their way from the Andes down to the lowlands, there are all these large waterfalls that one has to traverse in order to follow the rivers down. And, now, these are all pictures that Schultes took, so think of that through his eyes. This is one of the waterfalls on the Rio Apapores. This is approaching that waterfall. This is the placid river that approaches the waterfall, and this mist and steam you see coming up here is created by all that water flowing down in this big cataract out of the Andes. Here is on the other side of that waterfall where things slow down a little bit again. But the Amazon is fed by all these tributary rivers, and each of these rivers is not just, as I say, a meandering river at all, but full of these rapids and cataracts and It's very difficult to navigate, and it's not just a boat ride, an easy boat ride down the river. Now, something about Schultes as a botanist. Schultes was trained at Harvard University, both his undergraduate and graduate work. He then became a professor at Harvard University. During his career, he published over 500 scientific papers and 10 books. And that is what is actually described in the book, The Lost Amazon, as well as the book that Wade Davis wrote called One River. Schultes collected specimens, as I said earlier, and this is a photograph of this is a specimen that we have in the U.S. National Herbarium. Usually you take plants when you're in the field, whether it's in the Amazon or whether it's on the Potomac River, and you flatten them, you dry them, you take notes about them, they come back, they're mounted on sheets of paper, and little information is included on the label here about where it was collected, when it was collected, anything characteristic about the plant. And this is one of the plants that Schultes collected on the Amazon during those 12 years. Here is the actual plant itself. He took a photograph of it before he made a specimen of it, and now we can study both things because we see the plant, how it looked in its living state, but we also have a permanent record of it stored in the herbarium, so we can study it now, 50 years later. We'll be able to study it in 2 years. The U.S. National Herbarium, which is on the 4th and 5th floor of this museum, not open to the public, has 4.7 million specimens just like this. And the botanists in that department, we spend our days studying these specimens to record and document and understand the evolution of and classification of these plants. Now, Schultes, because he was a prominent botanist and collected so many species of plants were named after him, and here's just a few of them listed here. You may not be able to read that, but things like Herrera schultesii, Justicia schultesii, Paruma schultesii, Varrola schultesii, even genera, which is the next highest category of naming plants, were named after Schultes. Schultesianthus, Schultesiophyton, Rhesia. They ran out of names for Schultes, so they took his initials for this one, R.E.S., Richard Evans Schultes, and named it Rhesia nubicula after Schultes. And probably one of the most proud things that he was proud of was that also a new genus of cockroach was named after him, called Schultesia, and there's a specimen of that cockroach also in the exhibit. So botanists do get around. They just don't collect plants. They also get things like cockroaches named after them. I'm particularly lucky as a botanist because I didn't have a cockroach. I had a floral mite named after me, a little tick-like thing. It's about the size of the head of a pin, but it's named Cressii after me, and I'm extremely proud of that. Unlike Schultes, who carried a picture of that cockroach around in his wallet, I don't carry a picture of my mite in my wallet. Now, why was Schultes on the Amazon anyway? Here is a picture of Schultes, and then he took a number of self-portraits. He must have set his camera up on a tripod and had a timer on it. And here he's examining a wild rubber tree in the rainforest of Colombia in the Amazon region. You can see the rubber dripping down here. It's been scarred. The rubber drips down here. Schultes was sent to the Amazon to study rubber. After his Schultes training, he started at Harvard in 1937 as an undergraduate. He was a pre-med student. He thought he was going to be a doctor. He was from Boston. He was born in Boston. His family lived in Boston, and he got into Harvard to study medicine. During those 4 years as an undergraduate, though, he took a course by one of the world-famous botanists at that time named Oakes Ames, who was the director of the Botany Museum at Harvard University, which still exists today. Oakes Ames taught a course on what he called economic botany. Economic botany is not really the economics of plants. It's really plants that are used by people. And Schultes took this course in 1940, just before he graduated from Oakes Ames, and it was so intriguing to him, he made the decision not to become a doctor, but to change his career and to study to become a botanist. So in 1930, he started as an undergraduate in 33, finished in 37. In 1937, he enrolled in the PhD program, staying at Harvard to work with Oakes Ames, and he received his PhD in botany, studying economic botany in 1941. Schultes spent his career, or his graduate training, studying plants and people, and he was particularly interested in narcotics, poisonous plants, and the rituals that surrounded plants that people used. And he did his dissertation on peyote, the hallucinogenic mushroom that is found in the southwest United States and northern Mexico. And you can actually read his dissertation if you go to Harvard and to the library there. He also published a number of papers that came out of that. When he graduated in 1941, he wanted to go to the Amazon. He'd only been there once for a short period. He wanted to go to the Amazon, and he got some funding from the National Research Council to spend 2 years on the Amazon. So in September of 1941, Schultes landed in Bogota and proceeded to head to the Amazon region to study how people and plants interacted in this very poorly known region of the country. 3 months later, in December of 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the country was drawn into World War II. At the same time that happened, the Japanese also took over all of the major rubber plantations in Southeast Asia. And suddenly the U.S. was faced with waging a major war with no source of rubber. And so Schultes, it was known that he was on the Amazon at that point. The U.S. Department of Agriculture got in touch with him and said, you are to map the rubber resources of the Amazon. Rubber is originally native to the Amazon region, to the forests in the Amazon. It was taken out, and the big rubber baron era in the 1800s was a result of rubber being discovered and natural rubber being taken out of the Amazon forest, collected from wild plants. But then the British started these plantations in Southeast Asia, and the rubber industry in the Amazon rapidly decreased, being replaced by these plantation-grown rubber plants. When World War II happened, then the idea was to try to rejuvenate these wild collected rubber industry in Colombia, and Schultes was the person to assess the resources in Colombia at that point. Here is a local woman in the Amazon region tapping rubber, and you can see you make cuts down the side of the bark. The sap comes out and it's collected in a dish, and then all of that is collected on a weekly basis and processed into rubber. Now, Schultes, I know this is a little hard to see. You can see this. This is one of his notebooks that he kept while he was on the Amazon for those 12 years, and we have one of his notebooks in the exhibit. Schultes recorded all of his field observations in these books. He recorded the plants he collected. He recorded this particular notebook. I was looking through it when we received it from Harvard. The first few pages are translation of the local Macuna language that he was trying to learn while he was down there into Spanish. And he spoke Spanish, so that Spanish then would be translated into his own English language. So these notebooks are full of things, including this was one letter he wrote to the Harvard Alumni Association in 1952. They had lost track of Schultes. Obviously, he was not particularly in Cambridge during those 12 years. And he was writing a letter to the Alumni Association, letting them know what he'd been doing over the last decade, which was essentially exploring for plants in the Amazon. And so he describes his work there, and he said, some people think that explorers in faraway places are living dangerous lives. To me, it's much to drive in Boston than it is to canoe down the Amazon. And he goes on to explain how he got there and everything else. It's really quite interesting. Also, and you can see this one a little bit better, the page open in the exhibit is Schultes' own map of the Rio Apaporis, which is one of those major tributaries of the Amazon. When Schultes was sent there to map the rubber, he was given the charge of mapping this unknown river and determining what the extent of wild rubber was along the borders of the Apaporis. It's about 1,500 kilometers long, and he spent his 10 years doing that. You can see this map. The page of his notebook is open to this in the Amazon. Now, the Amazon goes through seasonal cycles just like any other region of the earth. During the dry season, it's easy to walk through the forest. It's relatively open in that part of Colombia and Brazil. During the rainy season, though, when all the rains start flowing, the Amazon floods, it expands way out, and the only way to get around is by dugout canoe or regular canoe. And here's a photo of Schultes exploring these forests, these inundated forests, collecting plants down around the region of Leticia. He took, as I say, many photos of the places he explored, whether it was the rivers or the mountains or the forests. Here's an absolutely lovely shot of a misty morning in a lowland wet forest in Colombia, and you can get some idea of the sorts of areas that he was traveling through. Here's an interesting photo. This is Schultes right here and his assistant, a Colombian assistant that he had. He's looking up at this large banana-like plant. He has a certain expression on his face. You can go up to the exhibit and see it a little bit clearer than here. I know exactly what he was thinking there, because I've tried to collect the same plant in the same region of Colombia. He's saying, how the hell am I going to get this plant into my plant press? This is a giant thing. The inflorescences are about 4 or 5 feet tall. He's got these leaves that are 10 feet tall. And he collected this plant. We have a specimen of it, a record of it. I was able to track down where this plant was and have done the same thing. So I knew what he was thinking when he was looking here. The other way I knew what he was thinking was I was a student of Schultes. I was at Harvard as an undergraduate in the early 1970s, which was rather a tumultuous time to be on the campus at Harvard. I must admit there was a lot going on. There was a whole cadre of students surrounding Schultes, both graduate students and undergraduate students, including Wade Davis, Timothy Plowman, some of you may have heard of him, Andy Weil, the vitamin guru, believe it or not, studied with Richard Evans Schultes at that time. Andy had both a medical degree and a degree in anthropology. Many others. Mark Plotkin, who's a major conservationist based here in Washington also. All of us were hanging around the Botanical Museum at that point, being inspired by Schultes. I started my own career, or my own undergraduate training, I should say, as a philosophy major at Harvard. Talk about a nebulous major. Well, I was a philosophy major, and I was looking for something a bit more concrete. So I, in a similar way to Schultes, decided I would take a course on botany to see what that would be like. These are the first 2 pages of my own class notes in Schultes' 1972 class that he called Plants and Human Affairs, Biology 104. Here he lists some of the things we're going to do. Here is his first, are the notes I was taking of his first lecture on foods and nutrition. Schultes would walk into the classroom every day. He was the epitome of the Harvard professor. He would come in with his white lab coat buttoned all the way up to the top with a tie on, little wire-rimmed glasses that he wore. He'd walk across the lecture hall up to the lectern and then start giving his lecture on whatever it might be, whether it was food, plants. I think I have. Here is one of his lectures. I was taking notes on narcotic plants. As I said, he was particularly interested in hallucinogens and mind-altering plants. Here is one lecture I took notes on that he gave on poisonous plants. Schultes started this lecture by, again, walking into the class with his white jacket on. He walked right past the lectern over to the wall, took a 10-foot blowgun off the wall, proceeded to put a dart in the blowgun. He held it up to his lips, and he blew a dart over all of our heads into a target on the other side of the lecture hall, right into the middle of the target. None of us stood up for the rest of the lecture. And when Schultes hit that target across the room is when I decided to become a botanist myself. I realized that this was the sort of thing that I wanted to explore. I wanted to go to places where I could find new plants, where I could go to places that botanists hadn't been before, and begin to help in this documentation of plants and understanding how plants are distributed around the world. So I finished Schultes' course in 1972, and the next year I took my first collecting trip to Jamaica, and then the next year I took my first trip to Colombia, accompanying Schultes on one of his visits down to Bogota. It was probably one of the most exciting things that's ever happened in my life. Schultes took many photographs of plants while he was there. Here's one unknown orchid. We still haven't identified his species yet. We have a specimen of this. He named this plant Valosia phantasmagoria because it was used in one of the local hallucinogenic preparations of the people in the Amazon region. Schultes did not only document wild plants collected in the forest that people were using, he also went into many of the villages, he went into towns, he took photographs and took records of the plants that people actually were selling in the markets and were exchanging in the markets. And this 2 lonely cucumbers here kind of epitomized in the Chris Murray and Wade, in my own mind, some of the breadth of what Schultes was trying to do in his documentation of plants used by people. Now, Schultes, a little bit about Schultes, the photographer. As I said, he carried his Rolleiflex camera with him wherever he went during these 12 years. After using a digital camera myself for the last 5 years, I really don't know how he spent 12 years accumulating all of that film, all that black and white film, not knowing what each of these images were going to look like till he could get it back and get it developed. But he took many of those photos, and through these photos, he was very meticulous in keeping records. Every photograph he took, he deposited, he put in a little paper envelope with a print of the negative on the outside of the envelope and a quick little note of where it was taken and something about it. Here is that one of him, self-portrait with a rubber plant in the Rio Pacoa. All of these then were cataloged up at Harvard, and this was the source of the photographs that we looked through to find the ones to put in this exhibit. Now, Schultes didn't just go to the Amazon basin. He did spend most of his time there, but he could not help from going up to the Andes with some of the most exciting habitats in all of South America. The Andes of Colombia have two main mountain ranges that are separated by a large valley, and Schultes spent a lot of his time up in those mountain ranges too. This is at about 3,000 meters. It's an area called the Paramo. The Paramo is very different from the rainforest that he was spending time in. It's got these very strange-looking plants that look like they're from another planet. Here's another shot. They're called Espelitia. And this was a plant that was studied by one of our own great botanists here at the Smithsonian, Jose Cuatro Casas, who himself spent 40 years documenting the plants of the Andes, primarily of the country of Colombia. But most of the photos really are of the Amazon region, and that's what I'll show you for the rest of the slide talk. Here's the Rio Caquetá, one of the other major tributaries into the Amazon. As I said earlier, the Amazon is not just a slow, meandering river that it's easy to navigate throughout its length. Here you can see two of Schultes' assistants pulling their dugout canoe over some rapids. And this was the way you could go from one calm place to the next, but there was always a set of rapids that either had to be portaged around or the boats were pulled over a spot that allowed them to move from one place to the next. The rivers at that point, when there were so few roads in that region of Colombia, served as the main source of communication between local peoples, the main source of transportation to get goods from one area to the next. It was also very much the center of life for many of the local people here. And besides taking these very rugged photographs that I'm showing you of the waterfalls and the rainforest and things, Schultes also took a lot of photographs of people. And here is another one of his river shots, a very simple image of a woman with her young child washing clothes on the banks of the Amazon River, or one of the tributaries of the river. And this pile of clothes, we suspect, is probably Schultes' own field clothes that she was washing. And he was documenting this kind of everyday life of people on the Amazon, not just when they used plants, but the things they did. He was particularly interested in growing up on the Amazon and how young boys would grow into manhood and how they would learn the various customs and rituals that were part of the everyday life down there. And he took a number of interesting photos that you could see in the exhibit of boys doing what they do. Here there are three boys in a dugout fishing with bow and arrow. Here's two above one of those major waterfalls, looking down at the falls, and Schultes is able to somehow capture just the lives of these people in a very sincere fashion. Here's one of his photos of two boys in fiber hammock down in one of the villages that he visited. Schultes had this way of taking photos of people, usually one or two people in the photograph doing what they are doing, in this case sleeping, and there's always one that's looking right at the camera, right at Schultes. If we go back to one, for example, this one, here are the two boys, one steadying the boat, one fishing, and here's one looking right at Schultes, right at the camera. So it was a way of actually integrating the people with what they were doing, but also with the presence of Schultes taking these photographs. Now, as I said earlier, Schultes' primarily interest was hallucinogenic plants, narcotic plants, medicinal plants, even though he recorded how people used plants in very many different ways. And a lot of the information that he gained about these were from the shamans, the local healers that were in the various villages. And there's a series of photographs, and for me to show these one after another doesn't really do justice. We've grouped all of these photographs that Schultes took of these various shamans that he worked with in one part of the exhibit, so you could stand in the center and just get this panorama of the people that Schultes was dealing with on a day-to-day basis as he was gathering this information. They're all from various tribes, whether they're from the Kofan, whether they're from the Makuna. Schultes kept very clear notes of the plants that the people were using and the rituals that surrounded them. Here's a Makuna family. What these images also show is Schultes was there, as I say, in the 40s and 50s, a half century ago, at a time that appears to be a real transition phase in the people of the Amazon. And a photograph like this really shows that. Most of the people in typical natural native dress, although some making the transition to Western influence here. Here you can see one woman in a missionary dress, and she clearly stands out from the outfits of the other people. When we look at some of these other photos, here was one of Schultes' main, I don't want to say informants, but one of his main sources of information about the medicines, the natural medicines that people were using. Here he is in all of his everyday costume, and he's holding a little harmonica in his hand right here, which kind of shows this transition phase, this influence of Western cultures into the native cultures down in the Amazon region. And Schultes was there at a time when this transition was just beginning to occur. Now, not all the shamans were men. There were women shamans as well, and Schultes certainly didn't hesitate to gather information and talk to women. For one, I'm not quite sure if I would have wanted to talk to this particular severe-looking shaman, but evidently she was one of the best. Another one. And here they all are kind of grouped together. Schultes was known, or became known, in the late 1900s as the father of ethnobotany. As I said earlier, economic botany or ethnobotany is the study of plants used by people and how people use those plants. Schultes kind of followed in the tradition of his own Professor Oakes Ames, of other botanists that explored the Amazon region before him, that recorded the way people use plants. But it was really Schultes and the 10 books he wrote and the hundreds of papers that he wrote about plants and people that earned him the title of the father of ethnobotany. And so when you go up to the exhibit, think about Schultes not only as an explorer of the Amazon, which he certainly was, and here is Schultes sitting on top of Cerro Campana, which is in the middle of the Amazon region of Colombia. It's an isolated mountain, just this big massif in the Amazon region. Very unique plants occur in this mountain. Schultes climbed it and collected and documented it. But most of his work was really focused in the villages, around towns, along the river, working with the people, looking at the way they were using plants, making collections of those plants, learning the local names for the plants, the uses and the rituals that surrounded them. And for that reason, he is known and probably will always be known as the father of ethnobotany. Now I'd like to invite you either to ask questions or go up to the exhibit and see it for yourself. Thank you very much. Yes?
What would I see if I went to this place?
There's still many inaccessible places, or difficult to access places in that part of Colombia and in Brazil as well, but it's certainly you would not see the same things that Schultes saw there. There's been, population has grown in many of those regions. There's a much stronger Western cultural influence on the people down there. There's been a lot of deforestation. It's not all deforested by any means. There's still a lot of rugged, wild country, but you would not see the same thing that Schulte saw. You certainly would not see the same sort of people and with the same sorts of customs that he experienced at that time. And that's a half century ago. Down here? First here in the front and then back. You know, I don't really, as far as I know, Schultes had no professional training in photography at all. He was a botanist. He wanted to record the things he saw, both the plants, the places, and the people, much like those of us that are botanists that go out with a camera as well as a plant press in hand. All of his photos, I should not give the impression that Schultes was down in the Amazon, in the rainforest for 12 years straight. He would constantly go back and forth to Bogota once a year, where he would keep most of his things and store his photographs until he took them back to Cambridge, where they were all processed. They were all then stored in the archives at Harvard University and now are in the possession of his wife, who's still living, Dorothy Schultes. I do not know if he was influenced by any particular photographers, but he certainly has influenced me in his photography, just looking at it that way. Question? Excuse me? Oh gosh, I'm not sure if I could pick out one medicinal plant. When I was actually there in the 70s, he had just received a grant to study the plant called erythroxylin, which is the plant that produces coca, which is chewed in the high elevation regions of Colombia and is processed in here into cocaine. But it's a native plant that's used extensively, both in the Andes as well as down in the Amazon River. And he was studying the native species of erythroxylin to see how the plants were related to each other and the local uses and all this. Is just a big plant. I think his work with erythroxylin was one of the most important work that he did. That was picked up by one of his students after that. But I think it was really the breadth of plants that Schultes collected and documented rather than one particular thing. As I said, peyote was his dissertation, and all of us that have done dissertations think of that as our major early contribution, and certainly his work on that. He didn't describe as many plants as he found and were described by others. Here? No, I would. Yeah, the question is the plants that Schultes collected and documented, are there still living specimens of these there? Are they all gone now? No, many of them are still there. We know some species have gone extinct or at least threatened because the habitats have been degraded. But many of these plants evolution is always at work. I should say even though I was influenced by Richard Evans Schultes to become a botanist, I decided that I would not become an ethnobotanist. Even though I was interested in how people use plants, I was really more interested in just your question. How did all this diversity of 400,000 species of plants on the planet today, how did that evolve over 100 million 150 million years? And those are the questions I've been studying. Yes, we know that plants are changing constantly. We're doing population studies where we can see within any population of plant a certain range of variation and how that variation shifts from one generation to the next generation, which is really the process of evolution. To evolve a species, that usually takes a much longer period of time, 10,000 years, 100,000 years. That's what we're trying to understand. But Schultes documented that sort of variation in the plants that he collected as well. But his main interest was people and plants. Yes? Good question, and I should have said that. Schultes did all this work. He mapped thousands of wild rubber trees. Just before they were ready to start processing this, synthetic rubber was introduced, and it replaced a lot of the need for wild rubber. And if you read Wade Davis's book, One River, he talks about the whole industry of rubber, from the rubber barons all the way up to the introduction of synthetic rubber. Some things synthetic rubber cannot be used for, and wild rubber is used for that. But the local rubber industry was never revived in the Amazon, was never revived to the extent that it was in the 1800s, although there still is rubber production today. for these kind of special uses.